Miss Pac Man, the special color edition for the Game Boy Color. To call this a mere colorized version of the Game Boy iteration of the same game would be somewhat, sort of accurate. We figured people would want to play their Pac titles on the go, and in color no less, so Namco shot these out in 1999. And truth be told, Miss Pac Man on the Game Boy Color is pretty much the same game that it was on the Game Boy Plain. It's pretty much the original arcade Miss Pac Man that can be played in the default scrolling mode, where all the graphics are full size and resemble those of the arcade game, which can only see a partial bit of the screen. Likewise, you could also play the game in a full screen mode, which reduces the maze so that it fits the entire Game Boy screen and you can see all the action all at once. Now, since I've already touched on the original Game Boy version of Miss Pac Man, I'm not really going to say a whole lot here, since it's pretty much a colorized version of that game, with notably improved sound quality over that initial release. Which, in retrospect, isn't really saying a whole lot because the sounds used here does not match those of the arcade original. I think in general, Pac Man did a far better job in its 8-bit iterations of replicating those arcade sounds, I think. And in this version of Miss Pac Man, there's still only one intermission tune played out during the intermissions. The arcade original had unique tunes for each intermission, of which I think there were 3 or 4. But aside from that, the sound is a bit better here than on the Game Boy Plain version. At least I think so. I didn't care for the sound in Miss Pac Man Plain. The added color to the Game Boy Color version does enhance the game tremendously in regards to the ghosts, because it's hard telling ghosts apart on a monochrome screen since each ghost has specific patterns and stuff, and this remedies that bit a bit. So you know which ghosts are what, and you know which ghosts have which patterns and stuff. Of course, if you're playing this on a Game Boy Plain, Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Super Game Boy, and yes, this is indeed backwards compatible with vintage monochrome Game Boys. This is pretty much irrelevant, although the display is mostly black rather than the mostly white space of the original release. I generally find that the blackness makes the game harder to see on a monochrome, but aside from that, it looks fine. The added color does give the game an almost NES feel to the visuals, if nothing else. But in any case, it's Miss Pac Man on Game Boy Color. Plays just as good as it did previously, controls fairly well, 2 skill settings to choose from much like the previous release, and there's a couple extra mazes for the Game Boy Color version if you're good enough to reach those mazes. I'm obviously not, but really I find the game plays fairly well, and not a whole lot to say in that regard really. On its own, this Game Boy Color iteration of Miss Pac Man would probably only get a mild recommendation if you don't already own a copy on Game Boy. Depends if you really wanted a version of the game in color, and like I said, you could play this on regular Game Boy, but in order to justify the special color edition, Namco also included as a bonus a port of Super Pac Man, another arcade game that has little to do with Miss Pac Man, but in any case. Now, if you've never played Super Pac Man before, it's your usual maze type game where you have to gobble up all the fruit and pellets from the maze to clear it, all the while avoiding the ghosts that will no doubt be chasing you all over the place. The key addition to Super Pac Man are doors that you'll have to clear out by collecting keys. Each keys open up a specific door or set of doors, and it changes every few mazes, so it adds an extra layer to the basic gobble everything up mentality. While it's not necessary to eat every key in every door to clear the level, you'll need to open some because most of the fruit is locked behind doors. So it's this element that lengthens the playtime of each maze because there's obviously not as much fruit as there were DOS. Also, in addition to the tried and true method of power pellets and energizer things that allows you to gobble up ghosts for a short period of time, there are also green power pellets that you could gobble up to transform into Super Pac Man. Essentially a giant Pac Man that can eat through doors and is even given a temporary speed booster ability you can activate at your leisure. You only have 2 of these as opposed to the 4 power pellets, however, so use them wisely. Super Pac Man certainly does give the game a bit of depth compared to its predecessors with its keys and doors and super power-up things, and switching which doors are opened by which key every so often does change around the strategy a bit. But Super Pac Man is a game, quite honestly, I find myself not touching on quite a bit. Much like the original Pac Man, there's only one maze layout and not much else. Don't get me wrong, the game plays fairly well. The rearranging doors opened by certain keys does spice things up a bit, but I'm just not a fan of the game. There seems to be more of an acquired taste than anything. It's not a bad game, it's just not the Pac Man for me. Much like Miss Pac Man, Super Pac Man allows you to play with full resolution graphics scrolling about the maze, or the maze fitted to the full screen. At the default view, the graphics of the arcade game made the transition to the Game Boy Color screen exceptionally well, I think, and the game makes full use of the screen, relegating score and lives count to the pause screen. It's a nice idea that gives the player as much viewing space as possible without cluttering the screen with information. On the full screen, the maze is pushed to the side to make room for scores and lives count. It'll be difficult at times to make out the doors on this size, and even on the Game Boy player I had a hard time telling whether the way was blocked or not, but aside from this minor issue, the game looks fine. As for sound quality, it sounds alright. I honestly couldn't tell you how this compares with the arcade original because quite frankly I've never played Super Pac Man in its original arcade form. But on its own, it merely sounds okay aside from the annoying jingles that play every so often. Not much I could say in that regard. Sorry. The way I see it, Ms. Pac-Man's Special Color Edition for the Game Boy Color is a nice little combo pack. Not only are you getting Ms. Pac-Man in color, but you're getting a bonus game in Super Pac-Man. Admittedly, I only picked this one up for Ms. Pac-Man as I love me some Ms. Pac-Man, and I don't think you can get enough Ms. Pac-Man. And I wasn't too sold on Super Pac-Man quite frankly, but hey, 2 for the price of 1 ain't too shabby. If you already own the old Game Boy version, it's a nice albeit frivolous update for the color and for Super Pac-Man, but if not, it makes a nice addition to the Game Boy collection, so why not?